In the fading light of an autumn evening, where the trees clawed at the sky like skeletal fingers, St. Mary's Convent stood as a forgotten sentinel on the edge of whispering woods. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a place where silence wasn't empty but pregnant with secrets that slithered just beyond hearing. Sister Agnes, the eldest among them, had always warned the others about the voices, those faint murmurs that drifted from the forest at dusk, like prayers twisted into pleas. But on that fateful night in 1957, as the moon bled silver through the branches, the nuns gathered in the chapel for vespers, their habits rustling like dry whispers against the stone floor. The candle flames flickered unnaturally, casting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord, and one by one, the sisters felt it, a chill that seeped into their bones, not from the cold, but from something watching, waiting. Mother Superior raised her voice in hymn, but it faltered as the first voice echoed from the woods, not a bird, not the wind, but a human cry, distorted and desperate, calling names long forgotten. Panic rippled through the group like a shiver, eyes darting to the darkened windows where faces might press against the glass, unseen but felt. By morning, the convent was empty, doors ajar, beds untouched, as if the nuns had simply dissolved into the mist. Only the echoes remained, lingering in the air, drawing the curious deeper into the mystery that the woods guarded with jealous hunger. In the crisp chill of a late October afternoon in 1978, deep in the tangled heart of whispering woods, a lone deer hunter named Thomas Riley pushed through the underbrush, his boots crunching over frost-kissed leaves. He had ventured farther than usual that day, chasing the faint trail of a buck that seemed to vanish and reappear like a ghost among the pines. The light was dying fast, bleeding orange through the canopy, when he stumbled upon something that made his breath catch in his throat. Nestled in a small clearing, half swallowed by vines and moss, stood the crumbling remains of St. Mary's Convent. The Gothic arches and weathered stone walls looked as though they had been forgotten by time itself, windows staring out like empty eye sockets. Thomas had grown up in the nearby town of Black Hollow, and though he'd heard whispers of the old convent as a boy, tales of nuns who vanished without a trace, he had always dismissed them as campfire stories meant to scare kids away from the woods. But now, standing before the sagging iron gates, a strange unease settled over him. He pushed the gate open. It groaned on rusted hinges but gave way without resistance. Stepping into the courtyard, he noticed immediately how unnaturally quiet everything was. No birds called, no squirrels chattered, no wind stirred the overgrown ivy clinging to the walls. Only the faint drip of water from a broken gutter broke the stillness. His shotgun hung loosely at his side as he approached the main doors, which stood slightly ajar, as if someone had only just stepped out. Inside, the air was thick and cold, carrying the faint scent of candle wax and something older, like damp stone and forgotten incense. Dust motes drifted lazily in the slivers of light that pierced the boarded windows. Thomas moved slowly through the foyer, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The chapel pews were still aligned in perfect rows, hymnals neatly placed as though waiting for a congregation that would never return. In the kitchen, pots sat on the stove, a thin layer of dust coating the congealed remnants of what might have been the last meal ever prepared here. Upstairs, the dormitory cells held narrow beds with blankets folded at the foot, rosaries draped over headboards. Nothing appeared disturbed, no overturned furniture, no shattered glass, no bloodstains or signs of hurried flight. It was as if the entire community of 43 sisters had simply stood up one evening and walked away, leaving their lives suspended in perfect, eerie order. As Thomas stood in the center of the abandoned chapel, the silence pressed heavier. Then, faintly, from somewhere beyond the cracked stained-glass windows, he heard it, a soft, distant murmur, like voices carried on the wind. Not words he could make out, but a low, rhythmic cadence almost like chanting or prayer. His skin prickled. He swung his flashlight toward the tree line, but saw only shadows shifting among the trunks. The sound faded as quickly as it had come, leaving only the oppressive quiet once more. Heart pounding, Thomas backed toward the door, suddenly certain he was not alone in the ruins. Whatever had taken the nuns 21 years earlier, he thought, might still be listening from the dark edges of the woods. Word of Thomas Riley's discovery spread quickly through Black Hollow, a small mill town still clinging to the edges of whispering woods. By early November, the county sheriff had poked around the convent, taken a few photographs, and declared it nothing more than an old abandonment from decades past. But the photographs, grainy images of untouched beds and dust-covered hymnals, found their way to a regional newspaper, and soon a man named Elias Crow arrived in town. Crow was a private investigator from Boston, lean and sharp-eyed, with a reputation for chasing stories the police preferred to bury. He had made his name unraveling insurance frauds and missing persons cases that carried the faint scent of something stranger. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in secrets, and the abrupt vanishing of 43 nuns in 1957 struck him as a secret too large to have stayed hidden without help. He checked into the town's only motel and began with the obvious: public records, newspaper archives, interviews with elderly residents who remembered the sisters. Most doors closed quickly, faces paled at the mention of St. Mary's. One retired postman admitted that mail to the convent had simply stopped being collected 1 week, with no forwarding address ever provided. The diocese claimed the order had been quietly disbanded and the women reassigned, yet no parish in the country could account for them. On his third day, Crow returned to the convent alone. He moved methodically through the dim corridors, flashlight in one hand, notebook in the other. In the Mother Superior's office he found a locked desk. The old lock gave way with modest persuasion. Inside were ledgers, financial records, and a series of leather-bound journals written in a precise, slanted hand, Mother Superior Cecilia's private writings. The early entries were mundane: accounts of harvests from the convent garden, notes on the spiritual progress of postulants, complaints about harsh winters. But as Crow read deeper, the tone shifted. Mother Cecilia wrote of restlessness among the younger sisters, of dreams that visited multiple women on the same night, dreams of voices calling from the woods in languages none of them knew. She described candle flames bending toward the windows as though drawn by an unseen breath, and nights when the entire community woke at the same hour, hearts pounding in unison. By the final volume, the entries grew frantic. She confessed to discovering forbidden texts hidden in the convent's foundation stones during repairs, books not in Latin or Greek but in symbols that hurt to perceive too long. She wrote of rituals performed in desperation to quiet the voices, rituals that only made them clearer, closer. The last entry, dated the evening before the disappearance, ended mid-sentence: "They are no longer asking." Tonight the pen had gouged the page, ink bleeding outward like a wound. As the days shortened and the woods grew heavier with frost, Elias Crow found himself returning to St. Mary's night after night, drawn by the journal's unfinished warning. He told himself it was professional curiosity, nothing more, but the truth was that the convent had begun to feel less like a crime scene and more like a place that refused to let him leave. On the 5th night, a thin layer of snow dusted the ground, muffling every footstep as he crossed the courtyard. He carried a lantern rather than a flashlight this time. Its warm glow felt less intrusive against the stone walls, as though electric light might offend whatever lingered here. The air inside was colder than the night outside, sharp enough to sting the lungs. Crow moved through the familiar corridors, past the chapel and up the narrow staircase to the dormitory, where he had begun cataloguing the sisters' few personal belongings: rosaries, pressed flowers between Bible pages, a child's drawing tucked into one novice's drawer. He worked in silence until the old grandfather clock in the hall below chimed midnight, its cracked bell sounding more like a groan than a note. Then, for the first time since arriving in Black Hollow, he heard them clearly. The voices began as a faint rustle beyond the broken windows, like dry leaves skittering across stone. But they grew, layering over one another until they became distinct women's voices, soft and urgent, rising from the darkness of the trees. Crow froze, pen still poised over his notebook. The words were not English, not Latin, yet they carried an unmistakable rhythm of supplication, as if the speakers were pleading with something vast and indifferent. He stepped to the nearest window, breath fogging the cracked pane, and peered into the night. Nothing moved among the trunks, yet the voices swelled, closer now, threading through the branches like smoke. Individual names surfaced amid the murmur: Sister Agnes, Sister Teresa, Sister Margaret, spoken with a tenderness that made the hairs on his neck rise. They were the names he had read in Mother Cecilia's journals, the sisters who had dreamed together, woken together, and vanished together. Crow's rational mind scrambled for explanations: wind through hollow trunks, distant radio static, teenagers playing pranks. But the voices shifted, addressing him directly. "Elias," one whispered, clear as a fingertip tapped against glass. Another repeated it, lower, from a different direction, as though circling the convent. His full name followed, spoken with intimate knowledge, the way a mother might call a child home at dusk. He backed away from the window, heart hammering against his ribs. The lantern flame quivered, casting shadows that stretched and twisted along the walls like reaching hands. For a moment he considered fleeing down the stairs and out into the snow, but the voices softened, almost coaxing, weaving a melody that tugged at memory and longing. They promised answers, understanding, an end to the questions that had driven him here. Crow gripped the windowsill, knuckles white, forcing himself to listen not with fear but with the cold precision he prided himself on. Beneath the choral murmur he detected something else, a pattern, a call and response that echoed the forbidden rituals described in the journals. The sisters had heard these same voices, had followed them, perhaps, into the woods. Snow began to fall harder outside, flakes swirling past the glass like pale moths. The voices rose with it, no longer pleading but commanding, drawing nearer, until Crow could almost feel their breath against the back of his neck. He turned slowly, half expecting to see figures in black habits standing in the doorway, but the room remained empty except for the growing certainty that he was no longer exploring the convent alone. The voices haunted Elias Crow long after he fled the dormitory that midnight, their echoes clinging to him like frost on his coat as he drove back through the sleeping town. Sleep became a fractured thing, broken by half-remembered names whispered in the dark. By dawn he was back at the convent, armed with the journals and a growing conviction that the answers lay deeper than abandoned rooms and spectral sounds. He began in the small library adjoining the chapel, pulling dusty volumes from sagging shelves while snow tapped insistently at the leaded windows. Most were standard devotional texts, but wedged behind a row of missals he found a thin folder of yellowed newspaper clippings, carefully preserved between sheets of acid-free paper. The dates ranged from 1892 to 1908, all local stories concerning the convent's founder, Father Ambrose Whitaker. Whitaker had been a charismatic priest sent from Boston to establish St. Mary's as a contemplative retreat for women seeking solitude from a rapidly industrializing world. The earliest articles praised his vision, describing lavish donations that funded the Gothic structure overnight. But later pieces carried a different tone, whispers of young postulants falling ill with unexplained fevers, of nighttime disturbances that drove neighboring farmers to complain of strange lights in the woods. One 1901 account detailed the sudden death of a novice during a winter storm, found frozen at the edge of the tree line, face serene, hands clasped as if in prayer, though she had been seen healthy hours earlier. Crow's pulse quickened as he uncovered a 1905 inquest report. 3 sisters had perished within a single month, each discovered in the forest at dawn, bodies unmarked yet rigid with cold despite mild weather. The coroner noted peculiar bruising around the wrists, as though bound by invisible cords, and eyes wide open, pupils dilated even in death. Whitaker testified that the women had suffered spiritual ecstasies leading them to wander, but townspeople muttered of darker influences. A final clipping from 1908 announced Whitaker's own disappearance while on retreat in the woods. His body was never recovered, though searchers reported hearing his voice calling from every direction at once. Cross-referencing the journals, Crow found Mother Cecilia's oblique references to the founder's shadow and warnings against disturbing certain foundation stones. The dates aligned too precisely to be coincidence. Every surge in disturbances, voices growing louder, dreams more vivid occurred on anniversaries of those early deaths. The forbidden texts she mentioned had been concealed, she believed, by Whitaker himself, brought from Europe and buried beneath the convent to anchor something older than the building. Kneeling in the chilly chapel, Crow traced his fingers over the flagstones, feeling for irregularities. One near the altar gave slightly under pressure, a hollow sound beneath. Dust and decades of wax had sealed the seams, but the stone was misaligned, deliberately so. Whatever Whitaker had hidden, whatever bargain or blasphemy had taken root here, it had waited patiently through generations of prayer and silence. As daylight faded once more into bruised purple, Crow sat surrounded by the clippings and journals, the weight of buried history pressing down like the low-ceiling beams. The convent had not been built on hollow ground, it had been built over something that refused to stay buried, something that had claimed its founder first and now reached hungrily for every soul drawn too close. The voices outside the windows began again, softer this time, almost conversational, as though sharing a secret they had kept since the very first stone was laid. Snow kept falling the next morning, thick and deliberate, as Elias Crow trudged along the only road out of Black Hollow. He had heard rumors of an old woman who once belonged to St. Mary's, a sister who left the order years before the disappearance and never spoke of it again. Her name was Clara Dumont, and she lived alone in a weathered cabin 2 miles past the abandoned mill, where the pavement gave way to gravel and the woods pressed close on every side. Crow found the place just after noon, smoke curling thinly from a crooked chimney. The cabin sat half-hidden beneath pines, its windows shuttered against the world. He knocked twice before the door cracked open, revealing a frail woman in her late 80s, silver hair pulled tight beneath a faded kerchief. Her eyes, pale blue and sharp, studied him with the wariness of someone who had spent decades guarding silence. She let him in only after he mentioned Mother Cecilia's journal. The single room smelled of wood smoke and dried rosemary. Clara moved slowly to a rocking chair by the hearth, motioning him to the table. Her hands trembled as she poured weak tea into chipped cups, but her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady and low, the kind that carried across chapel aisles. "I was 23 when I left," she began, staring into the fire. "They called it a crisis of faith. Truth is, I ran because I saw what was coming and knew I wasn't strong enough to face it." She described the nights when the voices first drifted through the dormitory windows, soft as lullabies at first, promising peace deeper than any prayer could offer. Younger sisters began sleepwalking toward the woods, only to be found hours later at the tree line, barefoot in the frost, smiling like children waking from beautiful dreams. Clara had been assigned to watch over Sister Agnes, the eldest, who fought the pull hardest. One evening she caught Agnes tracing strange symbols on the frosted windowpane, circles within circles, lines that hurt to follow. When asked where she learned them, Agnes whispered that the forest had taught her, that something ancient lived among the roots and trunks, something that had waited beneath the land long before Father Whitaker ever laid the first stone. Clara's voice dropped lower. "It isn't a ghost, Mr. Crow. It isn't the devil, either, though we tried every exorcism in the book. It's older. Hungry. It wears voices like masks." She leaned forward, knuckles whitening around the cup. "It learns your name, then your longings, then it calls you home." The sisters who vanished didn't run away. They answered. She warned him never to go into the woods after dark, never to speak his own name aloud where the trees could hear. "They're listening now," she said, glancing toward the shuttered window as though the pines themselves leaned closer. "They know you've been reading the journals, touching the stones. They'll use what you want most: answers, proof, maybe just someone to finally understand, and they'll wrap it in a voice you can't resist." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters like impatient fingers. Clara reached across the table and gripped his wrist with surprising strength, her skin papery but cold as the snow beyond the door. "Go back to Boston. Burn what you've found. Some doors were sealed for a reason." Her eyes searched his, pleading and terrified in equal measure, as the fire popped and sent shadows dancing across walls hung with faded holy pictures. Crow felt the weight of her warning settle in his chest, yet beneath it stirred the same stubborn pull that had brought him here, the need to know why 43 women had walked willingly into the dark and what waited there to greet them. Crow left Clara's cabin with her warning ringing in his ears, but the pull of the convent was stronger than fear. That same afternoon, under a sky heavy with unshed snow, he returned to the chapel armed with a crowbar and a determination that bordered on obsession. The misaligned flagstone near the altar had haunted him since discovering the clippings. Now he knelt before it, scraping away decades of wax and grime until the edges lifted with a dry scrape. The stone was heavier than it looked, requiring all his strength to pry it free. Beneath lay not earth but a narrow shaft of worked stone, steps spiraling downward into blackness that swallowed his lantern light whole. The air rising from below was colder, damper, carrying a faint mineral tang mixed with something sweeter: old incense, perhaps, or decay too slow to name. Crow hesitated only a moment before descending, the crowbar clutched like a talisman. The staircase ended in a low chamber no larger than the chapel above, its walls rough-hewn from the bedrock upon which the convent had been built. His lantern revealed a space that felt older than the building itself, as though the foundation had been poured around a wound in the earth. The floor was paved with flat stones arranged in concentric circles, each etched with symbols that matched the ones Clara had described, interlocking rings pierced by angular lines that seemed to shift when viewed from the corner of the eye. Along the walls stood crude niches, and in each rested remnants of lives abruptly ended, folded habits yellowed with age, rosaries tangled like vines, locks of dark hair tied with faded ribbon. 43 niches, Crow counted with growing dread, though some held only scraps of cloth or a single bone fragment polished smooth by time. At the center of the room rose a low plinth of black stone, its surface scarred by deep gouges as though clawed. Upon it lay the forbidden texts Mother Cecilia had feared, 3 thin volumes bound in dark leather that drank the light rather than reflected it. Crow approached cautiously, the lantern trembling in his grip. The pages crackled like dry leaves when he opened the first book, revealing script that twisted across the vellum in patterns more felt than read. Marginal notes in Father Whitaker's hurried hand annotated the symbols, translating fragments into Latin phrases about binding and invitation, about voices that were not voices but hungers wearing sound as skin. One passage, underlined repeatedly, warned that the entity beneath the woods had no name in any human tongue because to name it was to feed it. Dust motes swirled thicker here, as though the chamber breathed. Crow's shadow stretched unnaturally long across the symbols, fracturing whenever it crossed certain lines. He noticed then the faint stains darkening the grooves between stones old, flaked, but unmistakable. Not wax. Not rust. Something that had once been warm. The niches seemed to watch him, the folded habits stirring though no draught reached this deep. A low vibration hummed through the soles of his boots, rising slowly into a cadence that matched the voices he had heard above, only clearer here, intimate, as though spoken directly into bone rather than air. Names again, his own now woven among the sisters, patient and welcoming. Crow closed the book with deliberate care, yet the symbols lingered behind his eyes, pulsing gently like a second heartbeat. He backed toward the stairs, lantern raised high, illuminating for one terrible instant the far wall where fresh scratches marred the stone, new gouges, still sharp, as though something had recently tried to climb out. Crow barely slept after emerging from the underground chamber, the symbols burned behind his eyelids and the faint hum of the place still vibrating in his bones. He sealed the flagstone as best he could, but the convent felt different now, watchful, expectant. That evening the sky cracked open, unleashing a storm unlike any Black Hollow had seen in decades. Wind screamed through the pines, driving sheets of snow horizontally against the stone walls while thunder rolled low and continuous, as though the forest itself were growling. He had planned to leave before dark, but the gravel road out of the woods turned into a slurry of ice and mud within minutes. His car slid sideways into a ditch less than a mile from the convent gates, engine stuttering into silence. With no signal on his phone and the storm worsening, Crow had little choice but to trudge back through the blinding white, lantern swinging wildly in his numb grip. The convent doors banged open as he approached, though he could have sworn he'd latched them hours earlier. Inside, snow swirled across the chapel floor in frantic spirals, erasing his earlier footprints almost as quickly as he made them. He barred the doors against the gale and lit every candle stub he could find, their flames bending and flaring in drafts that came from no visible source. The temperature plummeted further, his breath hung in thick clouds that refused to dissipate. Alone in the vast stone shell, Crow settled into the Mother Superior's office with the journals and Clara's warnings for company. The storm outside muffled the world to a constant roar, yet beneath it the voices returned, louder, clearer, no longer drifting from the woods but rising from the very flagstones beneath his feet. They began as fragmented whispers, overlapping like echoes in a crowded cathedral, but gradually coalesced into something more terrible, screams. Not mindless howls of pain, but recollections raw, vivid memories wrenched into sound. He heard Sister Agnes pleading for the others to resist, her voice cracking with exhaustion. Sister Teresa sobbed a child's prayer she hadn't spoken since girlhood. Mother Cecilia's authoritative tone shattered into desperate Latin fragments as she tried to command whatever had come for them. The screams layered and looped, rising in pitch until the candle flames stretched tall and blue, shadows writhing across the walls like living silhouettes of women in habits reaching toward an unseen light. Crow pressed his hands over his ears, but the sound burrowed deeper, vibrating through bone and blood. Flashes accompanied the voices, now brief, involuntary visions of that final night, 43 sisters filing silently from the chapel into the storm-lashed courtyard, faces serene yet streaked with tears, barefoot in the snow, drawn by a chorus only they could fully hear. He saw them vanish one by one between the trunks, swallowed by darkness that folded around them like wings. The storm raged harder, windows rattling in their frames as though something immense circled the building. Snow piled against the doors until they groaned inward. Crow stumbled to the chapel, drawn by a new note in the chorus, his own name woven seamlessly among the sisters, spoken with the same aching tenderness. The screams softened into invitations, promising understanding if he would only open the door, step outside, follow. Lightning illuminated the stained glass windows in violent strobes, revealing for split seconds fresh handprints blooming on the inside of the glass, small, delicate, pressed outward as though someone on the other side longed to come in. The flagstone he had resealed bulged slightly, a faint rhythmic thumping rising from below. Crow backed against the altar, lantern sputtering, as the voices swelled into a single, harmonious plea that shook dust from the rafters and threatened to unravel every certainty he had ever clung to. As the storm finally broke at dawn, leaving the convent draped in a shroud of glittering ice, Elias Crow emerged from the chapel shaken but resolute. The screams had faded with the thunder, yet their echoes lingered in his mind like half-formed accusations, urging him to sift truth from terror. He retreated to the library once more, spreading the journals, clippings, and forbidden texts across the scarred oak table, determined to impose order on the chaos. The underground chamber's symbols mocked him from memory, but perhaps, he reasoned, they were not keys to some eldritch gate but triggers for a more human unraveling, one that history had seen before in cloistered walls. Cross-referencing Mother Cecilia's frantic entries with the Whittaker scandals, Crow uncovered a pattern buried in the convent's own records, surges of ecstasy that mirrored long-forgotten outbreaks in distant nunneries. The journals described nights when sisters awoke in unison, eyes glazed, murmuring phrases from the forbidden books as if reciting from a shared dream. What began as isolated visions, shadowy figures beckoning from the woods, spread like fever, sisters clutching one another in the dormitory, bodies trembling not with cold but with an inner fire that left them prostrate by morning. Cecilia had tried to quell it with vigils and confessions, but the contagion deepened. Novices spoke in tongues that echoed the biting mania of German convents in the 1400s, where one sister's compulsion to gnaw at her companions rippled through entire orders, from Saxony to Rome, defying exorcisms and leaving habits torn and blooded. Crow pored over a faded appendix in one of the texts, its margins alive with Whittaker's annotations, accounts of French sisters in the Middle Ages who meowed in chorus for hours, their collective caterwaul a cry against the celibacy and isolation that bound them. Soldiers had whipped the sound from their throats, but the underlying torment, the slow erosion of self under vows of silence and submission, persisted. Here, at St. Mary's, the trigger was subtler. The symbols, perhaps glimpsed in a crumbling wall during repairs, ignited a mass delusion where the woods became a siren call, promising escape from the grind of prayer and penance. The voices weren't spirits but projections of frayed psyches, amplified by the group's isolation, turning shared whispers into an irresistible hymn. Yet as Crow pieced it together, doubt crept in like fog through the cracks. The stains in the chamber below, the fresh scratches, could hysteria carve stone? He recalled Clara's words, the way her eyes darted to the shutters, as if the entity fed on belief itself, blurring the line between mind and malice. The sisters hadn't fled in terror, their faces in his visions were rapt, drawn by a euphoria that drowned reason, compelling them barefoot into the snow-swept trees. Possession or not, the journals ended with Cecilia's admission, "We have invited it in, mistaking hunger for grace." Crow traced the words with a fingertip, feeling the chill seep from the page, wondering if the 43 had dissolved into the woods or if the woods had dissolved into them, leaving only echoes to lure the next chorus. The afternoon light slanted low through the iced windows, gilding the symbols on the table in false gold, and for a moment, Crow swore he heard the rustle of habits in the stacks behind him, a soft, inviting murmur rising once more from the floorboards. The fog rolled in that evening like a living thing, thick and luminous under a moon that hung low and swollen above the treetops. Elias Crow had spent the day barricading himself in the library, poring over the texts until the symbols blurred into migraine pulses behind his eyes, but the pull grew unbearable, a soft, relentless tide urging him toward the tree line. He told himself he would only walk the perimeter, map the wood's edge for any trace of the sisters' path, yet when he stepped outside, lantern in one hand and crowbar in the other, the fog swallowed the convent behind him within moments, erasing the world until only muffled grey remained. The snow underfoot had crusted over, crackling softly with each step, but the voices were louder here, no longer filtered through stone or glass. They rose from every direction, weaving through the mist in overlapping harmonies, some pleading, some laughing, all intimately familiar. His name threaded through them now like a leitmotif, spoken with the affection of old friends waiting just ahead. Crow pressed forward, telling himself he was following faint depressions in the snow that might have been footprints once, though they shifted whenever he looked directly at them. Shapes moved at the edges of his vision, tall, slender silhouettes in black that dissolved when he turned. The fog thickened, coiling around his legs, tugging gently as if to guide him deeper. He caught glimpses, a pale hand reaching from behind a trunk, the hem of a habit vanishing between pines, a face turned toward him with eyes too dark and too knowing. Each time he swung the lantern, the beam cut through empty air, yet the rustle of pursuit grew closer, footsteps lighter than snow should allow. Panic flickered, but the voices soothed it away, promising that fear was only the last veil between him and understanding. They sang fragments of hymns he had never learned, laced with whispers of secrets the convent had buried, Whitaker's true bargain, the sisters' final ecstasy, the thing that wore their voices like borrowed coats. Crow stumbled over hidden roots, breath ragged, yet kept moving, drawn by a clearing he could sense more than see, a place where the trees parted in perfect circle. The chase tightened. Branches whipped his face though he passed nowhere near them, cold fingers brushed the back of his neck, gone before he could whirl. His own footsteps began to echo strangely, as though someone walked in perfect synchrony just behind him. The lantern flame guttered, casting wild shadows that mimicked fleeing figures ahead, dozens of them, habits billowing like ravens' wings. He ran now, heart hammering, crowbar raised against nothing and everything, the voices rising into a crescendo that vibrated through his ribs. Fog pressed against his skin like damp cloth, carrying the scent of earth and candle smoke and something sweeter underneath, almost floral. The clearing loomed suddenly, a pale emptiness ringed by trunks that leaned inward like conspirators. In its center stood a single figure, back turned, habit stirring though no wind touched the mist. Crow slowed, breath clouding, unable to call out or retreat. The figure turned slowly, face obscured by veil and shadow, yet the voice that emerged was his own, soft, coaxing, inviting him the final steps into the circle where the snow lay untouched and waiting. The surrounding voices swelled in welcome, no longer mimicking the lost but becoming them fully, 43 sisters extending invisible hands toward the man who had come so far to join their silence. Crow stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, lantern trembling in his grip as the veiled figure faced him fully, its habit stirring in a wind that touched nothing else. The fog pressed closer, thick as wool, carrying the mingled scents of pine resin and old wax, while the chorus of voices rose to a tender, unbearable swell, 43 sisters welcoming him by name, their tones layered with the intimacy of shared secrets. His own voice, issuing from the figure's shadowed hood, spoke softly of rest at last, of answers waiting just beyond the untouched snow at the circle's heart. He took one involuntary step forward, then another, the crust breaking beneath his boots with a sound like distant bones snapping. The crowbar slipped from his fingers, clattering dully into the drift. In that instant, clarity pierced the haze, the visions, the journals, the chamber below, all of it had been preparation, a slow erosion of doubt until curiosity became surrender. The entity had no need of force, it offered understanding wrapped in the voices of the lost, promising that to join them was not death but completion. Yet something rebelled in him, a final spark of the skepticism that had carried him from Boston into these woods. He focused on the small details, the way the figure's habit hung too still despite the swirling mist, the absence of breath clouding the air before its veil, the perfect circle of snow where no footprints marred the surface. The voices faltered for a fraction of a heartbeat, as though sensing his hesitation. In that gap he heard Clara's warning again, raw and human, "They'll use what you want most." Crow staggered backward, chest heaving, and wrenched his gaze from the figure to the ring of trees. The silhouettes he had glimpsed earlier resolved into nothing more than branches weighted with snow, yet the voices redoubled, pleading now, angry, promising every truth he had chased if he would only cross the line. His name became a roar inside his skull, drowning thought. He turned and ran, blindly, branches clawing at his coat as the fog twisted paths behind him. The convent's dark bulk emerged suddenly through the mist, doors still ajar as he had left them. He slammed them shut, barring them with trembling hands, then sank to the chapel floor amid scattered candle stubs and frost-laced pews. Silence fell, heavy and absolute, broken only by his ragged breathing. But as minutes stretched into hours and moonlight filtered through cracked windows, Crow understood the cruelest revelation. The voices had never been echoes of the past. They were lures, patient and eternal, cast anew for every soul drawn to the convent's mystery. The sisters had not been taken, they had become the taking, their longing woven into the chorus that now carried his name among theirs, waiting for the next storm, the next curious heart. Outside, the fog lifted slowly, revealing the woods serene and depthless, already forgetting the footprints that had almost crossed into silence forever. Inside, Crow sat motionless, listening to the quiet that was not quiet at all, knowing the invitation would come again, softer next time, tailored perfectly to whatever fragile hope still burned in him.